Hello, this is Yvonne Midier, and this is EQStitch video lesson number 10. And today we're going to be talking about text. I'm going to double click on the EQStitch icon on my desktop to launch my program. When it opens up to the tip of the day. I'm just going to close that box for now. I've already named a project for today, so instead of creating a new one, I'm going to open an existing project. And I've named this video 10, Creating Text with EQStitch. I'll highlight that and then say OK. I haven't created anything yet, so I'm going to close my sketchbook. And I can see that I am indeed in the right project because it is named in the upper left-hand corner of my screen. Now I'm going to be creating text for the embroidery machine today, so I need to be on the stitching work table. So we're going to click on the Work on Stitching icon. This puts us on the embroidery work table. I'm not doing machine applique, so this embroidery work table is where I want to be. We're just creating stitches. Now I want to create text with stitches, and if you look on the toolbar on the left hand side, I don't have a text tool. This is one of the hidden tools in the program. So I need to click on the little black arrow at the bottom of the toolbar, click on the word Add and Remove Buttons, and here I can add more tools. So I'm just going to put a check mark in front of each of them by clicking on it. I'm going to click on a blank spot on the screen to close the box. And now you can see I have more drawing tools available to me. I'm going to click on the text tool to start with. I'm going to the upper left hand corner of my drawing board, and I'm going to click, hold, and drag to the opposite corner and release. And that puts a box on my table. I'm going to double click on it to create the box where I can type my text. Now I'm going to make a couple decisions here. I am going to use the down arrow and I'm going to click on a text that looks to me like it's a very thin line, that it's not very thick, and you'll have different ones in your computer based on what fonts you've built in. Here's one that looks quite light, so it's a very thin looking line. I'm going to tell it I want the text to be 10 millimeters tall, and this is an approximate, and right now I have it set to justify to the left side of the box, and that's fine. So when I double click inside the box, I'm ready to type, and I'm just going to type a couple words here. Fonts with EQStitch, and you do have to spell properly. There is not any spell check for embroidery. That's good enough to start with. So fonts with EQStitch for embroidery. I'm going to move my cursor to the corner of my box. The cursor changes shape. I click once to set the font, and then I go to the top toolbar and I click on Convert to Patch. EQStitch sees every font as a patch. It does not see it as a single line. It is a patch that can be filled. Now once I've typed in my message here, I can't change the spelling, I can't change the font or anything. I have to retype it if I want something different. So let's say I want to change the font for the word for. I have my text tool here. I can create another box down here, and I can go double click on it to set it, tell it I want it to be 10 millimeters, and I can pick a different font. So let's pick one that's a script. Let's see what I've got here. Just anything will do, but this one looks like penmanship, so it's a script. Double click in my box, and I'm going to type the word for, and then click on the edge of the box, and then click on the text tool. So now I can use this script as the word for instead of this one up here. So all I need to do is, with the pick tool selected, click and drag a box around this word for, and hit my delete key on my keyboard. And then I can click and drag a box around this for, and then click and drag it up into place. Now I've mixed two different fonts, and that's what you have to do. You can't just type in a different one. You have to create a new text box for each type of font that you want. Now I can change the positions, I can resize these. Let's take a look here. I am going to first work with the word embroidery. Let's say I want the word embroidery to curve across the bottom of my page. Well, I can do that. I can go to my Bezier Curve drawing tool and select that, and I can click, hold, and drag somewhat of a curved line at the bottom of the page. Now, I don't want this line to actually show in my text. I just want to use this as a guideline to place my text onto. So what I've done is I've drawn this line, but now I'm going to go up to stitching, and I'm going to say convert to guides. And now it's converted it to a guideline. Now if I click on my pick tool and I click on each of the letters of the word embroidery, I can move them down and place them wherever I want them using this guide as a visible marker, so I can see how to place my letters along this curved line. Now again, the line itself does not stitch, it will not show. It's just a visual guide for me to look at when I'm placing the letters along the path. So you can certainly shape your words or your letters any way you want. You could look at the word with, and I'm just going to click and drag around here to select it. I'm going to move it over, and what I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to click on each letter separately. So I'm going to click on the I, move it underneath, the T, move it under that, and the H. So now I've converted this to a vertical stitch. So there's lots of different ways we can do this. I'm going to move the word for, and I'm going to move the word EQStitch down a bit. And looking at EQStitch, another thing we can do is we can move each individual out of alignment from the plane that it is stitching in. So again, with the pick tool, I can click on the Q and move it up, and the T and move it down, the I, make sure I've got the I, I'll leave the T where it is, the C, and the H. So you can certainly rearrange your letters that way too. There's one more thing that you can do that creates kind of a nice look. It's a little bit different. I'm going to click and drag a box around the word fonts. Now I'm going to make a copy of it, so I'm going up here and I'm clicking on clone selected segments. Now when I'm dragging around, sometimes it stalls on me a little bit. Gives me a bit of a hard time. So another way to move these rather than clicking and dragging is once it's selected, I can go to my arrow keys on my keyboard and I can simply arrow up and down any way I want to place this on top of what's already there. I'm just going to offset it for a second. So it looks like it's a shadow or a double line effect. I'll show you how that's going to look in just a minute. We're going to add stitches. So for now, what we needed to know was that we can move our letters, we can change our letters, we can change our script, we can have them be vertical, horizontal, we can do 2 layers of letters, we can take one individual letter, well, let's do the E on EQ, and let's make this E really big. And that's another thing you can do too. So there's a lot of options. But what I do want you to remember is that EQStitch sees every line of a letter as a patch. Now let's go to the Stitch tab. Now my program is set with the default settings. I haven't changed anything. So you can see the defaults obviously has a steel stitch outline and it's very big and bulky, and because this was such a tiny little font that we picked, it actually covers right up in the center where there's actually a fill stitch on each one of these words. So I'm going to have to zoom in order to see them a little bit better. I'm going to click on the zoom in tool, which is the little magnifying glass with a plus on it. I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to start with the word fonts, and I'm going to click and drag around fonts, and it's really hard to see because of the default settings. But I do want to see each one of these letters. So the first thing I'm going to do is change this steel stitch edge to a running stitch so I can see what's going on. So I'm going to click on the set edge stitch icon, and I'm going to click on the running stitch edge. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to click on each one of the letters to turn it to a running stitch edge. Now sometimes when you're doing this, it might hide the letter before. See, it looks like some of the letters are missing all of a sudden. That's because there's an area around each one of these that as you're working with this tool, there's an actual box around it and it overlaps the letters. Don't worry about it if it disappears. Just go up to the top of the screen, click on the refresh tool, and it all comes back. So now we can see there are indeed 2 layers of letters here. They're very, very fine, very tiny, because this was a very thin font. So this is a running stitch, and there's actually fill stitch on the inside of this, which makes it very difficult to see because the running stitch looks so thick that it actually covers the font inside. So on the 2 letter F's, I'm actually going to tell it to turn off the edge stitch. So we're going to click on no edge, and I'm going to click on those, and now you can see that there is actually a fill underneath. I'm going to click on refresh, and there's the fill. Now I'm zoomed in quite close, so it's difficult to see. I'm going to pick 2 colors. So I'm going to pick a yellow one for this one, and I'm going to pick navy blue for this one. Okay, so now you can see there's 2 fill stitches in there. And the fill stitches, the default for the program when you do a font, if you click on the set fill stitch, you can see that it's a smooth fill, and the angle is at 0 and the density shows there too. So that's the default. Now you may be tempted to use one of these fancy patterned fills. When your font is so tiny, the repeat of the stitches is actually bigger than the width of the font, and so you won't see the repeat of the pattern. Especially on a vertical one, on a horizontal one, you'll get little bits of it showing. So it won't be consistent. It will look pretty strange. So I always suggest that you use a solid fill or a consistent pattern fill across the fill stitch of a font that is very, very narrow. So let's try this brick wall. This is pretty consistent, and we're just going to apply that across there. Now remember, you're zoomed in really tight here, so it looks a little bit odd. What I want to show you is how to create a shadow on these letters. So we're going to go back to the artwork tab. We're going to click on this first one, and I'm going to use my arrow keys to get it approximately where I want it to start with, and then I'm going to click and drag and just ever so slightly overlap it. So now there's one behind and one on top, and when we go back to our stitch, we'll be able to see there's a shadow effect on there. And that's how you would move each one of those and get them so that you've got a consistent shadow. So let's go back. Let's turn off the edge on all of these now. And again, it's difficult because one is on top of the other. It doesn't like to have you clicking on it. You have to find where you can click to get it to take effect. And we're going to refresh, and there's our fonts. So the underneath one is the one that's furthest to the left. So there's the O, N, T. Nope, that's the wrong one. This one is the T and the S. And the top ones are the light ones. S, T, N, O. And go back to the artwork tab, and again, click on the top one and move with your arrow key to start with, and then you can click and drag it where you want it on the screen. So again, the reason I use my arrow key is because when I try to move the whole block of letters, it stalls on me a little bit, so I'd rather move it one letter at a time, use the arrow key, and then click on the center of the font in the crosshair to do the fine adjustment for placement. Okay, and go back to the Stitch tab, and now you can see a shadowed effect on the word fonts. I'm going to zoom back out, and you can see that you've got one under the other, and that gives you a bit of a shadowed effect. If you had a really thick, bold design, you would see it even more. So again, another thing we can do, of course, is we can have no fills and just have the outline. So if we go on the set edge stitch, I'm going to put it back to a running stitch, and I'm going to click on each of these letters and refresh my screen, and then I'm going to go to the fill, set fill, and say have no fill, and click on each of these. And sometimes if they're difficult to select, you can go back and zoom in, and you can see a little bit better. You'll know you've got it on there because you'll hear the little bell ringing. Then refresh. So now these are just outlines, but because this was such a very narrow font, it looks like the line actually stitches one on top of the other. If we select a color, we'll be able to see that a little bit better. And now you've got one where it's two lines very, very close to each other. I'm going to go back to my artwork tab for a minute and show you that if you truly want this to be one single line of stitching, you can make it that way. If you click on the shape tool and click on the letter, and I'm going to zoom in here, you can take these nodes and drag them over the top of each other. And there's still a node out here. I'm going to delete that one. Click and select this and delete that one. There we go. And now when you click on the Stitch tab, again, we're zoomed in way too close to see this. And we're going to set it back to a running stitch. Refresh. And we're going to color it. Refresh. And now you can see it looks more like a straight line. So you can take a patch and move the nodes of the patch to make it stitch like a straight line. That's one way to do it. There are other things that we can do. Let's look at the E here. If we click on the set edge and make no edge for the letter E, I'm going to make this just a little bit bigger. I'm going to go back to the artwork tab and select this. And I want to make this just a little bit beefier here. Okay. And go back to the stitch. And you can see this is the fill, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see that. And let's paint it so we can see it. So I'm going to make it a light green. There. Now we can see our fill stitch on that. So I have turned off the edge stitch and I have just a fill. When this stitches, it lays down underlay stitches. There's a default built into the program where it does underlay stitches and then it does the top stitch. If you don't want underlay stitches, you can turn them off. Now, if we look over here on our toolbar, there isn't an icon for underlay stitches, so we have to find that hidden icon. So we click on the little arrow on the right side at the bottom, click on Add and Remove buttons, and we click on the underlay for the fill and the edge stitch, and then click off on the page. So this is a fill stitch, and I want to turn off the underlay. So when I click on the underlay, This tells me that the default for the program was to have a perpendicular line stitch first, and then the fill goes on top of that. If I want to turn off the underlay, there isn't something here that says no underlay. You have to click on the little check mark in front of the word and deselect it. Do not click on adjust type. If you turn off that, that has done nothing. You have to have adjust type clicked on. And what adjust type tells you is it tells the program that you're going to give it a command. And the command that I'm giving it is to not do any of these underlay stitches. By not having them checked, I'm telling the program, because I have clicked on adjust type, to not stitch any of these. So I move my cursor over the letter and I click once to set that setting. So that's how you turn it off. It's exactly the same when you're on the edge stitch. When you click on the underlay for the edge stitch, the default for the underlay of this edge stitch is a parallel stitch. Now, if I don't want to have underlay for my edge stitch, again, I turn off the words that give the different types of stitches, but I leave adjust type clicked on because I'm telling the program, I'm giving it a command to turn this off, and then I click on the edge stitch and it has turned that off. Now when I click on the set edge tool, right now, previously we had it turned off. I want to have this on the letter Q. I want an edge stitch there. It is a steel stitch, but I want to make it a lot smaller. The default is 3 millimeters. I'm going to make that 1 millimeter and click on that and then hit refresh, and I can see my letter Q. Now my other ones are on top of each other because they're too big. So while I'm here, I'm just going to turn the edge stitches off on these others just so I can see what I'm doing. Hit refresh. I'm going to add thread color. And it doesn't like that these were all on top of each other. I have to zoom in because it's such a tiny stitch. I can't get my brush right on top. There we go. And then zoom back out. So EQStitch, this is an E that's a filled stitch with no outline. This is a Q that is a steel stitch outline, and this is fill stitches in here with the rest of the letters. Still a little bit difficult to see. Let me make them just a little bit different color. And of course I can't see any of that. Zoom back in. I've picked a very tiny font, and this is why it's difficult to see. You won't have this trouble if you pick a larger font. There. Okay. So that's another thing that you can do is you can turn on the properties. You can turn the properties on and off. You can color the different areas so you can see them. You can layer the different ones. Now, we had changed the font type on the word for. So let's see how that's going to look. We're going to zoom in here again. And of course it looks very blobby because it's a very thick satin edge stitch. So I'm going to go up to my edge fill and I'm going to say no fill, or no edge, and refresh. And then I'm going on my fill stitch, and I'm going to, it's set for a smooth fill, and I'm going to color it so we can see it. Now, this looks really pretty when you're zoomed up close. What I want you to remember is that there's areas of this where it's thicker and then thinner, and then it's really bold and then it thins out. Look at the O, how thin it gets right in here. Sometimes when their letter fonts are inconsistent in width all the way around, The stitches don't lay down as nice, and it doesn't look quite as nice when it goes to stitch. Because remember, a drawing or an image is not the same as a stitch, which is thread that has thickness and it can push and pull back and forth as it's being laid down. So you need to be a little bit careful of the fancier fonts. The ones that have thin and thick on them sometimes don't work. Just because there's a font built into a program does not mean it's going to stitch well. So make sure that you do test sewing to see how it's going to look. So let's zoom back out. And there's our word embroidery that's on that bit of a curve. And we can, I'm going to turn off the edge stitches so we can see it. And now what we're going to do with the word embroidery, I'm going to zoom in a bit. It's difficult to see on this screen. I'm going to put color on it so we can see it. And you can actually have every letter be a different color. And of course it's not wanting to. This is a really tiny, tiny font, and you have to get your brush right on the edge of the letter in order for it to take the color. So you have to zoom in and zoom out until you get the effect that you want. And I'm just going to scroll over and put some other. And what I'm doing is I'm repeating some of these colors, and I'm doing that on purpose because I want to show you how we can change how it stitches at the machine. Okay, I think I've got them all. Yes. So there's the word embroidery. It's in different colors of blues and browns and golds. Now right now when this stitches, it's going to stitch exactly in the order that I wrote it. So I wrote the word fonts with EQStitch. I did 4 afterwards. Remember, this is a different 4. This is the last thing we did. So it will stitch the word embroidery next and then jump up to the word 4. So let's watch that on our sewing simulator. And we're just going to see play forward, and we're going to see first there's the underlay stitches, and then I went back and I changed the word for, and then I created a copy of the word fonts to lay it on top to create a shadow. Now if you were stitching at your machine, it would stitch in the same order as which it was drawn, which means you're going to be changing your thread color back and forth and back and forth. So if you want to make it stitch all the same color thread before it goes to another one, all you need to do is go up to the top and click on the Sort Thread Color button. And you're going to have to give the program a moment to sort the thread colors because it's looking at everything that's on the page and it's thinking its way through. Now let's click on Play Forward, and it's done the dark blues, the green, the rusty colors, the lighter blues, the yellows. So now your threads have been sorted, so you're not having to change your threads at the machine. Let's go back and look at another thing. Let's go back to our artwork tab, and we can freehand draw a design if we wish to do so. Now I'm not very good at this. I'm using an external mouse. Some of you may use a pad with a pen and it might work better for you. So I am going to click on the freehand drawing tool, and I'm going to try and write my name. So I'm clicking, holding, and dragging my mouse, trying to write my name so it looks legible. Okay, so let's say that looks good. It doesn't, but we'll say it does. We're going to zoom in. And we can see that the O is not very nice, and there's a gap in the N here, and there's a gap here. So let's try and fix this a little bit. When we click on the Shape tool and click on the printing that we just did, we get nodes. Now sometimes it's better to have more nodes because there's more edit points. So what I want to do is I'm going to select this, but then I'm going to go up to the drawing board box and the drawing board options. I'm going to click on it, and under artwork there's the word freehand, and this is the freehand tool that I use to draw with. And there's a little slider bar here that says you can have a looser fit, which creates less nodes, or a better fit, which creates more nodes. I want more nodes to work with, so I'm going to slide it all the way down and say OK. And now what's going to happen when I click on the shape tool and I click on my name, I've got more nodes to work with. And I can actually move this around a bit and make it easier to shape my name. I'm going to add a node here by double clicking, and then I'm going to, whoops, wrong way, edit this to pull it over. And I'm just playing with the shapes a little bit to make it look just a little bit nicer. And I want this one to be more rounded. Okay, it looks a little better. Let's look on the Stitch tab. And again, the default is to have this to be a steel stitch edge. I want to click on the Set Edge tool. I'm going to click on a triple stitch or a bean stitch and click on the word, and it starts to look a little bit nicer. So you have to keep going back and forth and editing. I'll give it another color here till you get a nice smooth look, because right now it's pretty choppy. Now, one of the reasons this looks so choppy is because of the length of the stitch from node to node. It's quite long. When we click on Set Edge Stitch, you can see up here the stitch length is 3 millimeters. If I take it down to 1.5 millimeters and then click on the name, all of a sudden it's starting to look smoother. Now you have to refresh again, and now it's smoothing out a little bit and looking a little bit better. So that is one way to smooth it out a bit, is to have a shorter stitch length. And go back to the artwork tab, and again, of course, you can keep adding nodes, changing the shape, working with it that way so that you can get the look that you actually want for your handwriting. So it takes a little bit of practice. I'm not good at this. I don't use a drawing pad, and it probably would be easier with a drawing pad. But it is one way to create a linear stitch design and have it be more like the penmanship that we learned when we were studying our letters in school. So those are several different ways to create letters or text with EQStitch. So what I want you to remember is the font shapes and the font sizes. It will always be a patch. You can do some editing to create a straighter line by moving the nodes together. You can either choose to have it as a fill or an outline, or you can switch up your text and add different types of text together, or you can use the freehand drawing tool to draw your own text. So there are several different ways. Also remember that when you're looking at the underlay stitches, that you leave the word adjust type clicked on, but if you want no underlay, you unclick the words that talk about the types of underlay. So those are just a few tips on working with text. There's 100 different ways that you can create text designs to make them unique to you. Play around with the program, see what looks you can get. When you find one, make sure that you add it to your sketchbook to save it so you have it to go back to in the future. Enjoy the program.